This week, all of the artworks and classwork exercises are going to be centered around positive and negative space. We've touched on this already, but I want to emphasize with a couple of slides here and some discussion about what positive and negative space is. Positive space is the subject matter or objects in the artwork that take up space in the composition. The negative space is the area in and around those subjects. So you could look at it and say that it is the figure or the shape in the artwork that we refer to as the positive space. That's usually the subject matter, usually the most important part, usually where the magic is happening. The negative space is the background, the space in between or around the figures. That's usually the way that we look at and separate the background and the subjects. Now, often we look at those things, usually we present them as the white background and the black as the positive foreground. When you look at these examples of art, this is pretty typical for, most art presented as a sculpture. The subject is that positive three-dimensional form that you can walk all around, you could touch it. Photography, subject is whatever's in the frame, the main point of interest that's taking up probably the majority of the frame, in bright focus, lit with some kind of special lighting or highlighting the subject. Both of the examples on the right, the top one, the background is pretty clear and clean, and the subject matter is clearly central, and the positive space is where all the action is. So you can see that usually the subject matter is primary, the positive space is primary, and the subject is primary, and the negative space is there to support it. But the two are intertwined, and some artists put the negative space on equal playing field, equal ground, or even more important, so that the negative and the positive space become equal. Such as this artist, Kara Walker. She's a contemporary artist. She makes art right now. She's best known for exploring pretty controversial subject matter. Controversial by most standards, I would say. Okay, so she's exploring issues of race, gender, sexuality through her very recognizable and quite bold silhouetted figures. So we've looked at a couple of art forms that have really bold, high contrast silhouette type figures like the Notan, or even some of Banksy's like high contrast figures. Here's another artist who uses that very intentionally. Her artworks are not symmetrical like a Notan, but there is a very conscientious balance of black and white. She uses overhead projectors to also put colored light sometimes on ceiling walls and floors along with her black and white images. And a lot of her subject matter, in addition to those first topics, comes from sort of a black heritage and issues and ideas from the antebellum South, slave narratives, and historical novels. When you look at her artwork, here's an example from an installation. The positive and the negative are so intertwined, as with, the concepts of shadows and silhouettes. You can't have one without the other. There's no line work here. It's all just the shadow of the positive and the negative interplaying together. And it's very powerful. It's very powerful. People find her work to be um, sort of moving. It can be disturbing. It's highly symbolic. You know, it's got a lot of metaphor. Um, Things mean something. Oops, didn't mean to go that far. So I bring her up as a excellent example of positive and negative. There are many artists that we can look at for that. This last one that I was showing, you should have recognized, was almost a perfect example of symmetrical balance and that bilateral symmetry, which we've talked about off and on for the last month. Also, radial balance, which was the star of last week's project, which just leaves the last kind of balance, which is, you might think, no balance at all, because it doesn't involve radial or bilateral symmetry, but it's just asymmetrical balance, which means balance across the composition, not necessarily symmetrical at all. In fact, not symmetrical, but balancing your artwork across the plane so it's not all just shoved in one corner or on one side. So when we look at other artworks, when we're looking at the negative space and how the positive subject matter in Starry Night, things like the cypress tree, the very large stars, the town, what becomes the negative space, which is full of life still, pardon me, the sky, the swirls, that stuff takes on a life and becomes very important. Radial balance, found in examples like flowers. And the positive negative space here becomes some of the lines and the folds and the intricate shapes that peel off of that center. So the negative space becomes some of the plain, in this example, those plain flat shapes, and the darks and the lights of value kind of settle into the creases. Here's a painting by Rene Magritte. This is beautiful, symmetrical, bilateral symmetry. Right down the middle, you could cut this painting. So here are both, these are all three examples of real life paintings or artworks with all three kinds of symmetry. So we've got bilateral, radial, and asymmetrical, and using that power of um, uh, positive space and negative space with each subject, finding a balance, the positive space here being the man, the negative space being the background. And if we go all the way back to Kara Walker here, too, how we can use positive and negative space so powerfully in our artwork, no matter what kind of balance is being included.